Thank you. Oh, even better. Thank you. How many of you have seen me before, either here or other places? Oh, very good. I have fans. That's great. Both of you. Thank you. So I come to. Can we get some quiet here as we honor a fallen man? I'm not here to make him a saint, to canonize him, but there's probably a lot about this fellow that I'm about to talk about that you may not know or you may not remember. So let me set the stage. Let me tell you who I am. My name is Gideon Marcus. I'm the founder of Galactic Journey, galacticjourney.org, and I am a time traveler. So I live 55 years ago. That means that where I live, it is December 7th, 1963, which means it was only 22 years ago that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So it's still a big deal in recent memory. But the more important thing that happened recently is on November 22nd, John F. Kennedy was in a motorcade driving through Dallas, and 3 shots rang out, and half an hour later he was dead. And I cannot overstate the impact on this nation that this had. This is a fellow, and just on November 15th, he was in New York being mobbed by teen girls. He went to Florida a few days later to visit Cape Canaveral, which I understand they're renaming Cape Kennedy in honor of him. And it's just the idea that this guy is gone. No one has been assassinated, no president has been assassinated since McKinley 60 years ago. So this is a huge deal. The country basically stopped for 3 days. And I don't know if you guys saw the coverage. So on CBS, Walter Cronkite, you guys know who Walter Cronkite is? Walter Cronkite covered it from within just about 10 minutes after the shooting. They were the first on the air, and he sat there and talked to the camera for an hour. And the reports just came in, and he kept his calm, and he kept getting news. Okay, we now understand that the priests have been called in to give last rites. But that's something they normally do. Okay, we've gotten some unconfirmed reports that he's passed away, but no one has confirmed it officially. And finally the news came in from official sources: President Kennedy has been shot and killed. And for a moment, he was unable to speak, and he took off his glasses and he was choked up. And then he was back, all business. Meanwhile, at NBC, they couldn't get their reporters to get the mic in, so we had him talking on the phone and talking to the guy and repeating what he said. It was not nearly as polished a job, and I suspect CBS is going to get the plaudits for it. I'm not here to discuss assassination conspiracy theories. Is that what the future is going to be interested in? I will tell you this, though. Within half an hour of John F. Kennedy being shot, there were already 2 narratives. We had Walter Cronkite talking about how the shots came from the Texas School Book Depository. First he thought it was the 2nd floor, then he realized it was the 5th or 6th floor. And then we found a guy who was like 22, and he said, "It wasn't me!" And it wasn't. There was another guy who shot a cop. And they captured him, Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine and defector to the Soviet Union who had just come back to Texas. But on NBC, they had interviewed a woman who said, "I saw a man running away on the grassy knoll, and I was going to run after him, but I didn't know what to do." So that narrative began that day. However, December 5th, 1963, just 2 days ago, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI said Lee Harvey Oswald was acting alone. Now, of course, we'll never know because Lee Harvey Oswald was shot 2 days later. And I'll tell you, I did a show in LA on November 24th, and it was amazing going into an audience like this and saying, "You won't believe this, Lee Harvey Oswald has just been shot." Now, I don't know if you guys know who Chief Justice Earl Warren is. He's been tapped to lead a 7-person commission to investigate, but I'm sure they're going to conclude the same thing we already know. Kennedy was shot by one person. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. I want to talk about what Kennedy managed to accomplish in just slightly under 3 years, because it's profound, and you may not be aware of all of it. And again, not a saint, not perfect, and there's some things that if you're included into the White House, there's some rather shocking things but I'm not going to discuss most of them tonight because in 1963 we don't know. And it's before Christmas, so we're going to have a little Christmas spirit. Besides, when a president dies, I don't know if you people in the future have had any presidents die recently, but it's important to have a little bit of respect at this time, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with the policy. So let's talk about who Kennedy was. Kennedy came from a political family. He was in World War II as a Navy boat captain. He went on to be a congressman from Massachusetts and then a senator from Massachusetts. In 1960, he entered a crowded primary field, and it's interesting to note that back in 1960, primaries were not all elected by the people. Fully half the delegates were party bosses and stuff. I'm sure they don't have anything like that in the modern times and 55 years later.
They're still not elected by the people.
Well, that's good to know. So he was facing against Lyndon Johnson, who was a titan of the Senate from Texas. We had Stuart Symington, who was the first Secretary of the Air Force from Missouri. And you had Hubert Humphrey, a fiery liberal from Minnesota. It became very clear early on that JFK was the front runner and everybody else bowed out. And at first it looked like Symington was going to be the vice presidential candidate, but eventually Jack picked LBJ, even though he hated him. And not only did he hate him, but his whole family hated him. And the feeling was mutual. But LBJ had two things going for him. One, he was from Texas. And back then, Democrats could win in the South. In fact, the South was a Democratic stronghold. And also, LBJ was very good at getting things through Congress, because that was his place. He went up against the Republican candidate for president. You may know him, Richard Nixon. He hasn't been in the news much lately. Obviously, he lost that election after 4 debates and a very narrow loss in the presidential election. And then 2 years later, he ran for governor of California, and he was soundly whipped by Governor Brown. I don't know if that's a name that's familiar to you, Governor Brown. And he famously went on television and said, well, they won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. One can hope. So Kennedy is president now. What is Kennedy going to do? Well, things are very different for the Kennedy presidency. So before then, you had Eisenhower for 8 years. And Eisenhower was almost a compromise candidate, right? As my father used to say, wind up the Eisenhower doll, and it does nothing for 8 years. Kennedy came in, and his agenda was to basically revive the New Deal. He wanted a social program that the likes of which had not been seen in 30 years. And a big reason he was doing this was the economy was slowing down by the end of the 50s. And so he wanted to forestall that and make sure everybody had a shot. So, I don't know if you guys know this, but the New Frontier, there was like 55 pieces of legislation he sent to Congress. Ultimately, 40 of them passed, not even counting stuff that might get passed after his death. So we're talking things like FHA loans for people who aren't farms. We're talking about the Equal Pay Act for women. So equal pay for equal work and equal time. We're talking about an end to discrimination against minorities for federal jobs and federal contractors. We're talking about forced integration, enforcement of integration laws in the South. I don't know if you've been following what's happened in the South in 1961, 62, 63. First we had the Freedom Riders, right? We had integrated people, black people, white people, riding buses together down in the South, daring the Southern police people to arrest them. We had schools integrated for the first time. We had black men and women going to high school, going to college. We had our first black graduate of Ole Miss, James Meredith. And none of this stuff happened by accident. We had the governor of Alabama standing in the doorway of his university saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And the National Guard pushed him out of the way, figuratively and literally. Now, it's not over. We had 200,000 people march to Washington, D.C., a black and white March for Freedom in August. Martin Luther King spoke there. I don't know if you've heard his I Have a Dream speech. It was kind of a big deal. But it's not like the fight is over. Just a month later, four young girls in Birmingham were dead in a bombing the church and 22 others injured. This is a fight that's only going to get harder before it's won. Kennedy has made civil rights one of his platforms. He has put a comprehensive civil rights bill into Congress. There is resistance. We'll see if Johnson can pass it. I suspect he's more canny in Congress and he might be able to pass it. Something you may not know about. So Kennedy is a Democrat, which of course means that he is for lower taxes. So I don't know if you know this, right now the highest income tax rate is 91%. And this is something that's been in place since World War II. We have very high taxes in this country right now, all across the board and corporate too, because of wartime. And this has been part of the reason that the economy is stifled, John F. Kennedy said. So he put in a big tax cut bill for the rich, for the poor, and for corporations to stimulate our economy. And all the conservatives in Congress have said, we're not going to vote for this thing. We're conservatives. We don't lower taxes. Unless you think this is an isolated phenomenon, George Romney, the governor of Michigan, you may have heard the name Romney bandied about. He used to be the president of Studebaker. George Romney tried to raise taxes in Michigan because, he's a Republican and that's what Republicans do. And they voted that down. So, tax is a hard sell because everyone's always for the opposition. Another thing Kennedy did was he was in some ways for unionizing. So he introduced the ability of collective bargaining for federal employees. But on the other hand, there was a railroad strike not too long ago, and he put a kibosh to that. They were going to go on strike at midnight. It was going to be this crippling nationwide railroad strike, and he signed a law that said they couldn't do it. So, plus and minuses. So that's just the new frontier. That's just what he did on the domestic front. How did he survive on the foreign front? Well, you may have heard that things have been somewhat eventful in the last few years. So in 1961, Kennedy started his administration rather inauspiciously. So I don't know if you followed the debates, but one of the things he lambasted Nixon for, Nixon said, we are not going to let the islands of Quemoy and Matsu fall to the communists. I don't know if you know this, but Quemoy and Matsu are toothpicks off the coast of Taiwan. And apparently that's where we're going to draw the line against China. And Kennedy said, well, if you're so worried about Quemoy and Matsu, maybe you shouldn't have let Cuba fall. It was a great line. But then 3 months after this guy goes into office, we have the Bay of Pigs invasion. You guys familiar with the Bay of Pigs? 1,500 Cuban emigres tried to take over the island of Cuba, mostly unsupported. And they lost, and it was humiliating. And part of the reason why Kennedy didn't succeed with this thing was because it wasn't his. This was an operation that Ike had planned, and so he got it. So he had the choice of going whole hog endorsing it or letting it flop completely. And in the end, he had sort of a limp-wristed in the middle sort of thing, and it failed, and it was bad. And Khrushchev said, oh, I have an opportunity. No longer is there a bald person in the White House. My hairlessness shall take over the world. And then he started on Rocky and Bullwinkle. He was the Bordist. No, anyway. So Nikita, in August, sealed off Berlin with the Berlin Wall. And obviously, East Germany was such a workers' paradise that he had to build this wall to keep West Germans from flocking in to the Warsaw Pact, right? So that was a big deal. Now we've got East and West with a barbed wire fence between them. And it's not over just with that. Every so often, just a few months ago this happened, Russia will block the border and say, sorry, no convoys can go into Berlin. And then we're like, oh, we'll bring some tanks in. We're just kidding. Go on in. But this, we're worried that Berlin is going to be the flashpoint that brings us to war. Except it wasn't. You guys all know where the flashpoint was, right? Cuba. That's right. Cuba again. In 1962, Nikita thinks he's going to send short-range missiles to Cuba, And then in November, he'll say, aha, look what we did. We have missiles. Now you have to bargain. Except in October, we had planes that flew over Cuba, and we saw that there were missiles there. And if Kennedy did a bad job on the Bay of Pigs, I think we can all agree that he redeemed himself in Cuba. We were this close. I don't know if you're familiar with the doomsday clock invented by the Federation of Atomic Scientists. It's a very stark, very striking clock that shows how many minutes to midnight we have left.
We've never been closer.
In Cuba's time, yeah, 2 minutes. In 2 minutes to midnight. And at that time, the Soviets put these missiles there. We had the choice. We could attack them. We could do nothing. We couldn't quarantine. That's an act of war. So instead, we couldn't blockade. That's an act of war. So instead, we quarantined. So we surrounded Cuba with a bunch of ships and started inspecting Russian ships as they came. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, Khrushchev sent one peace offering, then he sent another. Kennedy decided to accept the one that he liked best and pretend that he never got the other one. And within a couple of weeks, the crisis was over. The missiles were taken out of Cuba. We verified that with our U-2 spy planes. And you may have noticed, completely unrelated, that we have dismantled our missiles in Turkey and Italy. Probably not related. That said, I know that sounds like we caved in. We didn't need those missiles anymore. We have Atlas and Titans that we can launch from the United States with pretty good accuracy. So that was a success, right? And after Cuba, despite the saber rattling in Berlin, things have gotten better overall. So for instance, there is now a hotline between the United States and between Washington, D.C. and the Kremlin. And I don't know if you know this, it is not a telephone. You know, Kennedy can't call, hey, Nikita, would you like to play golf today? That may happen, but it won't happen on that line. It's a teletype. But the nice thing about this hotline is, in case anyone ever does something crazy, we can say, hey, you may not want to do this. But that's not the most exciting peace-related thing that's happened recently. So just a few months ago, just 2 months ago, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was ratified. So I don't know if you ever been to Las Vegas. You know, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin, the Sands, the Dunes, right? All these Sahara, all these famous casinos that will never die because they're so iconic. And one of the things we know Vegas for is the fact that every couple of days you can go out on your balcony and watch them test nuclear bombs, right? Yes. Because who doesn't have enough strontium-90 in their diet? One of the things Kennedy passed was the Clean Air Act. He also passed Social Security for children of out-of-work people. He lets you take partial Social Security when you're 62. Hopefully they still have these things at 55 years. But I digress. Partial Test Ban Treaty. So we're blowing up these bombs all the time. And not only are we poisoning the atmosphere, but we're disrupting communications. And we're basically, these bombs are proxy. You know, we're showing off how big our missiles are, right? The Russians blow up Tsar Bomba, 52 megaton blast in Siberia. What do you do with a 52 megaton blast? Nothing except scare the other side. And so one of the ways you pull it back is you say, you know, why don't we stop blowing up these bombs? We don't need to blow up so many bombs. And they signed a test ban treaty that said we won't blow up bombs in space, which means our astronauts won't get irradiated. We won't blow up bombs above ground, which means the Vegas show is over, but that's okay. You can go to the Tropicana. They have a really good show. And try the veal. Tip the waitress. And you can't blow them up underwater. So the only place you can blow them up now is underground, which is less exciting, which means they'll do it less often. That's the first step. Here's another one. You may...
It's also detectable.
Right. That's the other thing. Right, you have to be able to trust and verify. Some president may say that someday. The folks at TRW in Redondo Beach invented a pair of satellites called Vela Hotel. And the Vela Hotel satellites, what they do is they enforce this ban. They can tell if someone blows up a nuclear bomb, and they will tell the boys on the ground, and then we can say, don't do that. And we call them up in the teletype and say, hey, after we play golf, do you want to not blow up nuclear bombs? So here's another exciting place of cooperation. But I'll get there in a second, because first I want to talk about space. In fact, most of the rest of this I'm going to talk about space. That's why you come here, right? So Hans runs a great store. The focus is space, which is why he ultimately let me in the first place, because my bag, I'm a space historian, and so I'm really big on talking about space. So let's talk about what Kennedy did for space. What did Eisenhower do for space? Well, he formed NASA out of NACA, which was not nothing. He created a space agency where nothing had existed before. And Eisenhower had the wisdom to let the Russians get into space first, so that the Russians wouldn't complain when we started sending stuff orbiting their country. And make no mistake, the Air Force every 2 weeks launches something that takes pictures of Nikita playing golf, where the glare does not beat too much off his forehead. But what did Kennedy do? So Eisenhower did not have a big plan for where we were going. Project Mercury was conceived under Eisenhower, and that was a one-person spacecraft to see if we could get in orbit. And this was sort of an answer in many ways to what the Russians were working on, and they beat us to it with Vostok. Mercury program ended in May with the flight of Gordo Cooper, and if you guys were in here in May or June, you heard me talk about that. And then the Russians had to do one better. They launched 2 shots, one of whom was commanded by a woman, which may be the end of their Vostok program, from what I understand. We didn't have a real plan what was going to come next. And then Kennedy came out in '61 and said, we're going to go to the moon before this decade is out. I'm really going to be sad I won't be able to do that impression anymore. Now I'm going to have to learn the Johnson impression and wear lifts in my shoes. Project Apollo was conceived under Kennedy. And it was conceived because he had an ambitious goal. He could have said, we're going to put another person in space. He could have said, we're going to build a space station. He could have said, we're going to build some more satellites. And he said, no. He tossed his hat, which he didn't wear, by the way. First president not to wear hats. He tossed his hat over the fence and said, we're going to go to the moon in 10 years with existing technology. And 4 years ago, there wasn't even a space program. I mean, that's incredible. And in 1962, we had a plan for what we were going to do. But the problem is, Apollo wasn't going to happen until 1964 at the earliest. And Mercury was going to end in 63. And there was a chance the Russians might launch stuff and make us look bad. And it was bad to look bad, because everywhere in the world, communism was growing. You may have heard of a place in Southeast Asia called Laos that almost fell to the communists. There's another place that is having some trouble with communists right now called South Vietnam. They just had a military coup a few weeks ago. I don't know if you know this, but there's 15,000 American troops in South Vietnam right now. So if we're not going to fight communism with missiles anymore, and we want to contain them on the ground, it's very cheap to beat them in space with ideology. So we need something between Mercury and Apollo. Right? Apollo's a 3-person craft. Mercury's a 1-person craft. What's between 1 and 3? Help me out. 2! And that's why we're going to have the Gemini capsule. The Gemini capsule, the Gemini program, is a 2-person space program. And its job is to bridge the gap between Mercury and Apollo. Now, Gemini and Apollo have been delayed. Gemini is probably not going to have its first crewed flight until 1965. Apollo is not going to have it until 67. But we still probably could have been putting people around the moon by the time of Kennedy's second term. And that's probably the biggest tragedy, is that Kennedy is not going to be around to realize the success that his vision has engendered. That said, Cape Canaveral has just been renamed Cape Kennedy, so at least the brave men and women who launch from there to the moon will be going from a place that has his namesake. Now, those are not the most significant things, I think, that Kennedy has done in space, by the way. I'm going to tell you about something I think is even more significant. But first, let me get back to the Soviet Union. Remember I said that he just did something amazing in regards to diplomacy with Khrushchev. Kennedy has been asking for the last 2 months, hey Nikita, after we play golf, maybe we could have a joint lunar mission. Think of it, Americans, Russians in space together. It's kind of a beautiful dream. It's also cheaper, is what he was thinking. Because I don't know if you know this, but in 1963, Congress is actually kind of down on space travel. They don't want to fund it anymore. I mean, we've already sent a person in space. Why do any more? I don't know if you guys, in the future, I think you may think of the 60s at this time where everybody just loves space and it goes on forever until we land on the moon. But as early as 63, there's already deep congressional resistance. And so one of the reasons Kennedy was suggesting we work with the Russians was it was a way to sort of share the cost and also to build diplomacy while building a space program. Congress immediately said no and voted in a proposition, which is going to get confirmed this month, saying we will not allocate any money for a joint space program with the Russians. So if we want to get to the moon, we'll have to do it on our own. The Russians were kind of lukewarm about it. Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkova came to our country a month ago, and Gagarin's like, it's not a bad idea, but I think maybe he's a little ambitious. So, but it is laying the ground for some things like astronaut exchange in case someone gets shot down, maybe not so much militarization of space. So Kennedy's legacy in this regard is not going to die even if Congress tries to make it stillborn. But let me tell you about the coolest thing Kennedy has done with regard to space, even cooler than sending people up. So I don't know if you guys noticed that last year we launched a little satellite called Telstar. You guys heard of that? So Telstar allowed for the first time, most significant event in history, television of a soccer game in Europe was able to be watched by Americans. It's huge, right? But it is huge because, I don't know if you go to the movies, you get the newsreels where you get every 2-minute summary of the news before your movie. You get your Bugs Bunny short and then you get your movie. Crawling Hand or whatever's the new science fiction terror in the drive-thru. And now you get the news immediately by satellite. That's huge. We now have the ability to relay communications in real time. Right after Kennedy's funeral, we transmitted by another satellite called Relay the funeral live to the Soviet Union, and they got to see what we were seeing. That kind of cracking of the walls between nations is huge. Next year, SYNCOM is going to relay the Summer Olympics when they happen in Tokyo. I'll be there, by the way, and I will take pictures for you. In 1964. So satellite technology is an amazing thing, and so the question is, where is it going to go from here? And the answer is it might not have gone anywhere if it were not for Kennedy. So imagine this. I don't know if picture yourself. It's 1963. What is the number one name in telecommunications? The company that runs telecommunications.
PRW.
AT&T. That's right. AT. Ma Bell is practically a branch of the government, and they control all communications. So even though Relay was built by Hughes, RCA, and even though SYNCOM was built by Hughes, and other companies want to get in on this satellite communication, the fact is AT&T has the muscle to have a monopoly. Not only do they have the muscle to have a monopoly, but they don't have incentive to develop satellite programming because they can lay wires across the Atlantic cheaper and just control the method of communication. So why even bother? So without any kind of federal involvement in satellite technology, there's the possibility that this technology doesn't go anywhere. We may not have satellite communications for the next 50 years. All right, we don't want AT&T to have a monopoly. What else can we do? Well, the Federal Trade Commission recommends, why don't we take the 10 biggest companies and let them form a consortium? Yeah, that's not antitrust. So then Kennedy comes up with this great middle idea. He creates a company called ComSat Corporation. And ComSat Corporation is federally funded, but the shares are owned by all of these major companies. So they have a stake. So when profits are made, these companies make money. And because of this, you get a shot in the arm from the federal government. And looking into the future, I'm not supposed to be able to tell what's over there, but I've talked to some of you, and you guys have these wonderful, they're like slide rules, except they have pictures on them and cat videos. And I've seen the future. Satellite technology is going to be huge come the end of the 60s, the 70s, and especially the 80s because of this, because of ComSat. And after ComSat, immediately after, foreign countries came together with a consortium called Intelsat, and then ComSat bought into Intelsat. And there were Intelsat satellites by 1965, I think. Communications satellite technology got a 20-year jump start because of Kennedy's idea to have government intervention in it. I think that is probably the most, communication, worldwide communication has probably got to be the most significant part of technology in the 21st century. And the fact that it got its start in the early 60s because of this, I think, is significant. And while I'm as big a booster as anybody, and I love Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom and Gordo Cooper and Valentina Tereshkova and all these big names. Neil Armstrong, he's an X-15 pilot, just joined the NASA astronaut corps. I think he's going to be in Gemini. I don't know if he'll do anything after that. Yeah, these are great, and I'm glad they happen. And even now, people are drinking Tang and singing the virtues of Velcro. But satellite technology, man, that's the thing. So I want to leave it with this. The question is, where are we going to go from here? I think the other great thing that Kennedy gave us was LBJ. I know. LBJ does not have the best interpersonal manner. It's true. But what he does have is the congressional wrangling chops and the gumption. And he's already met with Martin Luther King. That happened just a couple of days ago. He's already committed to all the things that Kennedy committed. He's going to push civil rights. He's going to push the New Frontier, which is rebranding the Great Society. He's going to do all these things that Kennedy did, and probably more effective in passing them. The tax reduction probably will happen in 1964 because of LBJ's talent. So whatever we may think of LBJ, and there's a lot of things you can think about LBJ, including his need to brand everybody, including his wife and his dog, with the initials LBJ. Whatever you may think of him, the fact is he is going to probably continue Kennedy's legacy better than Kennedy ever could have. So then the only open question is what's going to happen in Vietnam. Because there's 15,000 troops in Vietnam. And I know there's probably some people who think, well, Kennedy was really just playing around and he's really going to take those troops home. But there is nothing in November 1963 that gives anyone any indication that the war in Vietnam is winding down or that American involvement is going to draw down. So if and when Johnson continues the fight in Vietnam, it's probably not the best decision, but let's not blame it all on him. So the best way to end things, aside from that continuity, is to everyone have a drink in your hands. I'd like to raise a toast to our fallen president, John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States. Whatever his issues, and he has them, but I won't talk about them right now. Whatever his issues, the fact was, he accomplished a lot in his 3 years, and he deserves to be remembered for that. And I hope you enjoyed my telling you about this walk down memory lane, and perhaps you learned a few things as well. Thank you very much. By the way, I talk every quarter. I'll have another talk in February. I never charge for them. However, this year I became an author, a fiction author, for the first time. And my first book came out in August. And if you would like it, I have copies here for you. This is Tales of Alternate Earths 2. These are alternate Nova. I am the lead in this book. If you want a signed copy of this book, you can get it here today for $15. So if you want to support me and the journey and keep me coming here every quarter, please buy some books. And thank you again.